The steam still clings to everything in the locker room, a humid ghost of the showers that ran 20 minutes ago. It settles on the metal lockers, condensing into tiny rivers that trace downward like tears on painted steel. The fluorescent lights overhead buzz with that persistent electrical hum that becomes white noise after a while, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional green that makes skin look sallow and tired. I sit on the wooden bench, my sneakers half unlaced, the rubber soles squeaking faintly against the polished concrete floor as I shift my weight. The sound echoes in the empty space, bouncing off the tile walls and disappearing into the maze of lockers that stretch toward the showers. My hands work mechanically at the laces, muscle memory guiding fingers that feel suddenly clumsy, suddenly aware of themselves. The last of the wrestlers left 15 minutes ago, their voices and laughter fading down the hallway like a retreating tide. Coach Henderson followed soon after, his keys jangling as he called out a brief goodbye, the heavy door slamming shut behind him with that hollow metal sound that means we are truly alone now. Just the two of us in this cathedral of adolescent sweat and industrial disinfectant, where secrets feel both impossible to keep and too dangerous to speak. Across the room, Marcus leans against locker number 47, his back pressed to the blue-painted metal. He is silent, which is unusual for him. Usually by now, he would be making some observation about the practice, or telling me about a book he read, or asking if I want to grab dinner somewhere. Instead, he just stands there, his athletic bag at his feet, his dark hair still damp with perspiration, watching me with an expression I cannot quite read. I have known Marcus Delaney for 4 months now. For months since he arrived in our small town with his easy confidence and his careful way of listening that makes you feel like the most interesting person in the room. For months since Principal Martinez introduced him as our new athletic trainer, the man who would help our wrestlers avoid the kind of injuries that ended seasons and sometimes careers. For months since I first noticed the way he moves through space like he belongs wherever he chooses to be. But I've been watching him for longer than 4 months. I have been watching him since that first faculty meeting when he sat 3 chairs away from me, and I found myself studying the line of his jaw when he spoke, the way his hands gestured when he explained his philosophy about preventive care and proper stretching. I have been watching him in the way that men like me learn to watch, carefully and quietly, storing away small details like a collector hoarding treasures. The sound of dripping water comes from somewhere deep in the shower area, a steady percussion that marks time in this suspended moment. Somewhere beyond the locker room walls, I can hear the distant hum of the school's ventilation system, the occasional rumble of a car passing on the street outside, the ordinary sounds of a world that continues to exist even when your own world has contracted to the space between 2 people in an empty room. Marcus pushes himself away from the locker, a small movement that seems to contain multitudes. His hands move to the bottom hem of his polo shirt, fingers gripping the fabric, and I realize with a shock that runs through me like cold water that he is going to take it off. Here, now, with me watching, I should look away. Every instinct I have developed over 28 years of careful living tells me to look down at my shoes, to busy myself with the stubborn knot in my left lace, to pretend that this moment is not happening. Instead, I find myself frozen, my hands stilled on the white cotton strings, my breath caught somewhere between my lungs and my throat. He lifts the shirt slowly, deliberately, the damp fabric peeling away from his skin with a soft whisper. The motion is unhurried, almost ceremonial, as if he is revealing something sacred rather than simply changing clothes after a long day of work. The shirt comes up and over his head, and I see the landscape of his torso, the definition earned through years of training and discipline, the small constellation of freckles across his left shoulder that I have never noticed before. But it is the scar that stops my heart completely. It runs across his right collarbone, a thin white line about 3 inches long, raised slightly from the surrounding skin. It looks old, settled into permanence, but somehow still vulnerable, like a secret written in a language I am only beginning to understand. The scar catches the fluorescent light and holds it, a small beacon in the geography of his body, and I realize I'm staring with an intensity that borders on reverence. Marcus does not look away from me as he drops his shirt onto the bench beside him. His eyes, brown with flecks of gold that I have cataloged during hundreds of stolen glances, hold mine with a steadiness that feels like a challenge and an invitation simultaneously. There is no smirk on his face, no suggestion of teasing or casual display. This is something else entirely, something that makes the air between us feel thick and electric. I swallow hard, the sound audible in the quiet room, and my hands tighten involuntarily on my shoelaces. The simple act of breathing has become conscious work, each inhale requiring deliberate effort, as though the oxygen has become too heavy for my lungs to process efficiently. The question hangs unspoken in the steamy air between us. Not a question of words, but something deeper and more fundamental, something that has been building in the spaces between our conversations, in the moments when our hands have accidentally brushed while moving equipment, in the way he sometimes pauses mid-sentence when our eyes meet during practice. It is a question about possibility, about crossing lines that once crossed cannot be uncrossed, about acknowledging truths that have been living quietly in the shadows of our carefully constructed professional relationship. I am 28 years old, and I've spent most of those years building a life that is safe and predictable and utterly mine. I teach English literature to teenagers who mostly do not care about metaphor or symbolism, and I help coach a wrestling team because the extra stipend pays for my books and my modest apartment and my carefully curated solitude. I have learned to find satisfaction in small pleasures and private victories, in a way a well-crafted lesson plan unfolds, or the moment when a reluctant reader discovers a story that speaks to them. But sitting here in this locker room, watching Marcus stand half-dressed in the fluorescent light, I understand with sudden clarity that all of my careful construction has been preparation for this moment, when safety and predictability feel like prison walls, and the possibility of something real and dangerous and transformative stands 3 feet away from me, waiting. The world outside these walls continues its ordinary business. Somewhere, teachers are grading papers and parents are cooking dinner, and students are doing homework or avoiding homework or falling in love with people who are supposed to love them back. The expectations and assumptions that govern my daily existence wait patiently for me to return to them, to remember my place in the careful choreography of small-town life. But in this moment, in this humid cathedral of lockers and echoes, all of that feels impossibly far away, as distant as stars or childhood, or any of the 1,000 things we think we understand until they're suddenly, irrevocably changed. My life before Marcus arrived was built on patterns that felt like armor. I would wake at 6:15 each morning to the same alarm clock I had owned since college, make coffee in the same blue ceramic mug my mother gave me when I graduated, and drive the same route to Millbrook High through streets that never changed except for the seasons painting different colors on the same trees. The apartment I rented on Elm Street reflected this deliberate simplicity. Books lined every wall from floor to ceiling, their spines creating a taxonomy of my interior world. Classics mixed with contemporary fiction, poetry collections wedged between philosophy texts, the complete works of authors who understood loneliness as both burden and sanctuary. Movie posters from the 70s and 80s hung in frames I had salvaged from estate sales, their faded colors suggesting stories about people who lived more boldly than I had ever dared. I taught English literature to juniors and seniors who moved through my classroom like visitors in a museum, politely observing exhibits they could not quite connect to their own lives. The Gatsby unit each spring, the poetry month that made them groan, the research papers on themes they chose from a list I had refined over 6 years of teaching. I was good at what I did, competent and respected, the kind of teacher who received adequate evaluations and occasional thank you notes from students years later who remembered me as fair but distant. The wrestling coaching happened almost by accident. Coach Henderson needed an assistant when his previous helper moved away, and the modest stipend appealed to me more than the work itself. I knew enough about the sport from my own brief high school career, enough to help with basics and supervise practices, but I lacked the passionate investment that defined men like Henderson, who lived and breathed wrestling seasons like other people follow religion. My colleagues at school treated me with the casual friendliness reserved for someone who contributes adequately but never quite belongs to the inner circle. I attended mandatory faculty meetings and skipped optional social gatherings. I graded papers in the teacher's lounge while others discussed their marriages and mortgages and weekend plans. They assumed my solitude was a choice rather than a necessity, a preference for books over people rather than a carefully constructed defense against exposure. Then Marcus arrived on a Tuesday in late August, walking into the faculty meeting with the kind of easy confidence that made everyone take notice. Principal Martinez introduced him as our new athletic trainer, fresh from completing his certification after his playing days ended, ready to help our athletes avoid the injuries that derailed promising seasons. Marcus smiled at the room, made appropriate eye contact, answered questions about his background with just enough detail to seem open without revealing anything truly personal. I watched him from my usual spot near the back, studying the way he held himself with perfect posture but no visible tension, as though his body understood something about occupying space that mine had never learned. When he mentioned his college football career ending due to injury, there was no self-pity in his voice, just a matter-of-fact acknowledgement that some doors close so others can open. His laugh, when Martinez made some joke about keeping our wrestlers healthy enough to win state, carried genuine warmth without the forced quality that marked most professional interactions. After the meeting, he approached me with a handshake and a smile that reached his eyes. "Marcus Delaney," he said, "and I'm looking forward to working with the wrestling team." I told him my name and my role, expecting the conversation to end with polite pleasantries, but he asked about my teaching background, about how long I had been coaching, about the team's prospects for the coming season. His questions suggested genuine interest rather than social obligation. Over the following weeks, as practices began and routines established themselves, Marcus integrated into the rhythm of our program with remarkable ease. He arrived early to set up his training station, stayed late to ensure equipment was properly stored, and moved through his work with a competence that spoke of serious preparation. The wrestlers gravitated toward him naturally, drawn by his combination of expertise and accessibility, the way he could explain complex physiological concepts in language they understood. But it was during the quiet moments after practice that I began to notice something else about Marcus, something that felt like recognition without understanding why. He would linger in the training room, cleaning equipment that was already clean, organizing supplies that were already organized, as though he were reluctant to leave the enclosed world of the gymnasium for whatever waited outside. Sometimes he would make conversation about books when he noticed me reading during breaks, revealing a familiarity with literature that seemed at odds with his athletic background. His observations were thoughtful, his questions genuine, his listening complete in a way that made ordinary topics feel significant. There were moments when our eyes would meet across the gym and hold for a heartbeat longer than casual interaction required. Moments when his hand would brush mine as we moved mats or adjusted equipment. Contact that felt both accidental and deliberate. Moments when his laugh would linger in the air after everyone else had moved on, as though he were sharing something meant specifically for me. I told myself these observations were meaningless, the product of too much solitude and too many novels about people braver than myself. Marcus was new in town, naturally friendly, professionally collegial. The attention I thought I detected was probably nothing more than the courtesy of someone building relationships in an unfamiliar environment. Yet something in his presence began to feel like gravity, a force that made my carefully constructed distance seem not protective but hollow, not peaceful but empty. In the evenings, alone in my apartment surrounded by books that had always been sufficient company, I found myself thinking about conversations we had shared, replaying small moments with an intensity that surprised me. The way he had described his injury as a gift that led him to discover his true calling. The way he listened to my thoughts about teaching as though education were a noble calling rather than a job I had fallen into by default. The way the space between us seemed to vibrate with possibilities I had spent years teaching myself not to see. The regional tournament fell on the kind of October day that feels like a promise broken by winter, gray clouds pressing low against the sky that had forgotten how to hold light. Our wrestlers had performed better than expected, placing 3 in the top 4 of their weight classes, and the energy in the gym had been electric all afternoon. Parents cheered from bleachers that creaked under their enthusiasm. Coaches shouted encouragement that echoed off the high ceiling, and the air itself seemed to pulse with the intensity of young men pushing their bodies to the edge of what they thought possible. By evening, the gym had emptied except for the custodial staff breaking down chairs and the coaches finishing paperwork. I had stayed to help Henderson load equipment into the storage room, a task that required more lifting than talking, which suited my mood. The day had been successful, but success in high school athletics carries its own weight of expectations for what comes next, and I found myself feeling oddly depleted rather than celebratory. Marcus appeared in the doorway as I was stacking the last of the foam mats against the wall. He looked tired but satisfied, his polo shirt damp with the day's exertion, his hair slightly disheveled in a way that made him appear younger and more approachable than usual. He carried his athletic bag slung over one shoulder and held 2 bottles of beer, their labels already beating with condensation in the humid air. "Thought you might want one of these," he said, extending a bottle toward me with a smile that seemed both casual and carefully considered. "A thank you for all the help today. You really went above and beyond with the kids." I accepted the beer without thinking, my fingers brushing his for a moment as I took the bottle. The glass was cold against my palm, a small shock of temperature that seemed to travel up my arm and settle somewhere in my chest. We moved to the wooden bench that ran along the far wall, sitting with perhaps a foot of space between us, close enough that I could smell the faint cologne he wore mixed with the honest sweat of a long day's work. The beer was good, crisp and clean with a slight bitterness that matched the autumn evening. We drank in companionable silence at first, the kind of quiet that develops between people who have shared extended time in high-stress situations. The gymnasium around us seemed larger in its emptiness. Our voices, when we finally began talking, carrying further than they would have during the crowded chaos of the tournament. Marcus told me about his college wrestling days, how different the sport felt when practiced at that level of intensity and commitment. He described training sessions that lasted hours, the careful attention to nutrition and sleep and recovery that became a way of life rather than a hobby. His voice carried a wistfulness that suggested he missed aspects of that structured existence, the clarity of purpose that came from dedicating everything to a single goal. I found myself sharing stories I rarely told, memories from my own brief athletic career in high school, the way literature had saved me from the disappointment of discovering I lacked the physical gifts necessary for sporting success. Marcus listened with the kind of attention that made ordinary experiences feel significant, asking questions that revealed genuine curiosity about my transition from frustrated athlete to dedicated teacher. The conversation meandered through territory that felt both safe and dangerous, touching on disappointments and discoveries, on the ways we had each found our current lives through a combination of choice and circumstance. There was an intimacy in the sharing that went beyond the simple exchange of biographical information, as though we were carefully mapping the territory of each other's interior worlds. As the evening progressed, Marcus shifted position on the bench, turning slightly to face me more directly. The movement brought him closer, close enough that I could see the small scar on his chin that spoke of some childhood adventure, close enough to notice the way his eyes seemed to hold flecks of green alongside the brown I had cataloged during dozens of stolen glances. He mentioned an old shoulder injury from his playing days, rolling his shoulder experimentally as though testing for residual pain. The motion made him wince slightly, and before I fully understood what was happening, he was gripping the bottom of his polo shirt and beginning to lift it over his head. "It's still tight sometimes," he said, his voice carrying a note of explanation that seemed aimed at both of us, especially after long days like today. The shirt came away in one smooth motion, revealing the landscape of his torso that I had glimpsed weeks ago in this same room. But now, in the dimmer light of evening, with the tournament's energy still humming in the air between us, the sight carried a different weight. The thin scar across his collarbone seemed more prominent, more significant, like a map of vulnerability drawn in white ink against his skin. I should have looked away. Every instinct developed over years of careful living told me to focus on my beer, to comment on the tournament results, to deflect this moment into safer territory. Instead, I found myself studying the scar with an intensity that bordered on hunger, tracing its path with my eyes while my hands remained frozen around the beer bottle. Marcus noticed my attention, of course. How could he not? But instead of the embarrassment or casual dismissal I might have expected, he held my gaze with a steadiness that felt like invitation and challenge simultaneously. His eyes asked a question I wasn't sure I was ready to answer, offered a possibility I had taught myself not to see. For a moment that lasted either seconds or hours, we existed in a space outside normal time, outside the gymnasium and the school, and the carefully constructed roles we inhabited during daylight hours. The air between us felt electric with potential, heavy with the weight of words neither of us was quite brave enough to speak. Then Marcus reached for his shirt, breaking the spell with a movement that seemed both necessary and tragic. But as he pulled the fabric over his head, his eyes never left mine, and I understood with sudden clarity that something fundamental had shifted between us. Some line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. That night, alone in my apartment, I dreamed of the locker room again. But this time, in the logic of sleep, Marcus's hand reached across the space between us and covered mine, warm and sure and unafraid. The days following that evening in the gymnasium carried a different quality, as though the air itself had been subtly altered by whatever had passed between us. Marcus began finding reasons to linger after practice, ostensibly to organize equipment that was already organized or to discuss training protocols that had been established weeks earlier. But I recognized these excuses for what they were because I was constructing my own elaborate justifications for staying late, for walking slower to my car, for accepting his offers to help carry equipment I could easily manage alone. Our conversations expanded beyond the professional boundaries that had previously contained them. Marcus would mention a book he was reading, and I would find myself recommending authors I thought he might appreciate, surprised by the depth of his literary curiosity. He spoke about poets I hadn't expected him to know, quoted lines from novels that revealed a sensitivity at odds with the straightforward athletic persona he presented to the world. These discoveries felt like small treasures, glimpses of interior complexity that made him more fascinating rather than more familiar. There was a carefulness to how we moved around each other now, an awareness that hadn't existed before that evening with the beer and the scar and the weight of unspoken possibilities. When we passed equipment between us, our hands would brush with what felt like deliberate accident, contact that lasted a heartbeat longer than necessity required. When we stood close to review paperwork or discuss a wrestler's progress, I became conscious of his proximity in ways that made concentration difficult, aware of his breathing and the subtle cologne he wore and the way he unconsciously shifted his weight when he was thinking. The parking lot conversations began almost by accident. After practice one Thursday, Marcus walked me to my car as he had started doing regularly. But instead of the brief goodbye that usually concluded these interactions, he leaned against my driver's door and asked what I was doing for dinner. Nothing planned, I told him, which was true but incomplete. I never had dinner plans, had structured my life around the solitary pleasures of takeout and books and evening silence. There's a place downtown that makes decent burgers, he said, if you're interested in some company. We drove separately, but arrived at Mickey's Grill within minutes of each other, as though we had silently agreed that appearing together might communicate something we weren't ready to acknowledge. The restaurant was the kind of local establishment that had survived decades without changing, red vinyl booths and black and white photographs of the town's football teams from the 1960s, a jukebox that played songs from an era when everything seemed simpler. Over fries that were perfectly crispy and burgers that justified their reputation. Marcus told me about his childhood in a smaller town than ours, about parents who had supported his athletic ambitions until injury forced him to discover other talents. I found myself sharing memories of my own family, stories about my mother's quiet encouragement of my reading habits and my father's well-intentioned but misguided attempts to interest me in more traditionally masculine pursuits. These dinners became a regular occurrence, though we never explicitly planned them as such. Tuesday or Thursday evenings, after practice had ended and the school had emptied, one of us would suggest food, and the other would agree with a casualness that fooled neither of us. We developed preferences for corner booths that offered privacy, learned each other's favorite menu items, established a rhythm of conversation that could stretch an hour meal into 2 hours without either of us noticing the passage of time. The texting started during one of these dinners when Marcus asked for my number under the pretense of coordinating wrestling schedules. But the messages that followed went far beyond professional necessity. He would send photos of books he encountered in stores, asking for my opinion on authors or genres. I found myself sharing articles I thought might interest him, passages from novels that had struck me as particularly insightful, observations about teaching that I had never articulated to anyone else. Late at night, lying in bed with my phone glowing in the darkness, I would read his messages with an attention that bordered on analysis, parsing word choices for hidden meanings, searching for clues about his feelings that he might not even be conscious of sending. The conversations meandered through topics both mundane and profound, creating an intimacy that existed parallel to our physical interactions, but felt equally significant. Clara noticed the change in me before I was fully aware of it myself. Clara Manning had been my closest friend since my second year of teaching, a mathematics instructor with a sharp wit and a gentle way of asking probing questions. She had been hinting for months, with increasing boldness, that our friendship might evolve into something more substantial, suggestions I had deflected with a combination of obliviousness and deliberate misunderstanding. But during a faculty meeting in late October, when I declined her invitation to see a movie over the weekend, she studied my face with the kind of mathematical precision she brought to solving equations. "You seem different lately," she said. "Lighter somehow. More present." I told her I was enjoying the wrestling season, which was true but incomplete. She nodded as though accepting my explanation, while clearly recognizing it as insufficient, and I felt a stab of guilt that surprised me with its intensity. Clara deserved honesty, or at least the courtesy of a conversation that acknowledged what she was offering and what I was unable to give in return. But honesty would require admitting truths I was barely willing to acknowledge to myself. Instead, I began avoiding her outside of necessary professional interactions, taking different routes through the school hallways, eating lunch in my classroom rather than the teacher's lounge, declining social invitations with excuses that became increasingly elaborate. The behavior felt cowardly even as I rationalized it as kindness, protecting her from disappointment while protecting myself from conversations I wasn't prepared to have. Meanwhile, Marcus moved closer every day, not physically, but emotionally, occupying more space in my thoughts and gradually dismantling the walls I'd spent years constructing around the dangerous parts of myself. The transformation was so gradual, I barely noticed it happening, like watching seasons change or plants grow, imperceptible in any single moment, but undeniable in the accumulation of days. The revelation came on a Friday night in November, after our wrestling team had pulled off what Coach Henderson called a miracle victory against Riverside High. Our heaviest weight class had clinched the match in overtime, a dramatic reversal that sent the small crowd of parents and students into eruptions of celebration that echoed through the gymnasium long after the final whistle. The wrestlers had been electric with adrenaline as they showered and dressed, their voices carrying that particular pitch of excitement that comes from exceeding your own expectations. Henderson had stayed for the obligatory handshakes and brief interviews with a local paper sports reporter, but by 8:30 the gym had emptied except for Marcus and me. We moved through the routine of equipment breakdown with the efficiency of months of practice, stacking mats and storing headgear and wiping down surfaces that would need to be cleaned for Monday's practice. The work felt meditative after the intensity of the evening, our movements synchronized in a way that spoke of growing familiarity. Marcus suggested we celebrate the victory, but I found myself too drained for the energy that celebration would require. The day had begun before dawn with lesson planning, continued through 6 periods of teaching teenagers who were already mentally preparing for weekend freedom, and culminated in 3 hours of matches that had left my nerves raw from the constant tension of watching young men push themselves to their physical and emotional limits. "I'm exhausted," I told him, settling onto one of the wooden benches that lined the locker room walls. The admission felt more honest than I had intended, revealing not just physical tiredness, but something deeper, a weariness that had been accumulating for weeks as I navigated the increasingly complex terrain of our friendship. Marcus nodded with understanding, but instead of gathering his things to leave, he moved to the bench directly across from me, perhaps 6 feet of space separating us in the fluorescent-lit quiet. He sat with his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, and for several minutes we existed in the kind of comfortable silence that had become characteristic of our time together. The gymnasium beyond the locker room door was dark now, the custodial staff having finished their work and departed for their own weekend plans. Somewhere in the building, the heating system hummed its steady rhythm, and occasionally we could hear the distant sound of a car passing on the street outside, but otherwise we were enclosed in our own pocket of stillness. "I think I'm staying here because of you," Marcus said suddenly, his voice carrying a softness that made the words feel both casual and monumental. I looked up from my hands, confused by the statement's apparent randomness. "Staying where?" I asked, though some part of me already understood what he meant and felt my chest tighten in response. Marcus was quiet for a moment, his eyes fixed on something I couldn't see, as though he were gathering courage for whatever he intended to say next. When he finally stood and walked toward my bench, his movement was deliberate and unhurried, like someone who had made a decision and intended to see it through regardless of consequences. He stopped directly in front of me, close enough that I had to tilt my head slightly to meet his eyes, close enough that the space between us felt charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. His proximity made breathing feel like conscious work, each inhale requiring effort, as though the air itself had become too thick to process efficiently. "You ever feel like you've been holding your breath for years?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question landed with the force of recognition, describing something I had never been able to articulate, but had been living with for as long as I could remember. The careful way I moved through my days, the constant awareness of boundaries that couldn't be crossed, the feeling that authentic existence required a kind of vigilance that was exhausting to maintain. I managed a small nod, not trusting my voice to remain steady. Marcus lifted his hand then, slowly, giving me time to understand his intention and pull away if I chose to. But I remained frozen, caught between terror and desire, as his fingers touched my cheek with a gentleness that seemed to contradict everything I thought I knew about the world and my place in it. Then he was leaning down, and I was looking up, and the distance between us was disappearing with a deliberateness that felt both inevitable and impossible. His lips touched mine with a tentative pressure, as though he were asking a question and waiting for an answer, ready to apologize and retreat if I gave any indication that this wasn't what I wanted. But instead of pulling away, I found myself gripping the edge of the wooden bench with both hands, anchoring myself to something solid while everything else in my carefully constructed world shifted beneath me. I closed my eyes and let myself feel the warmth of his mouth against mine, the wrongness and rightness of it, the way this single moment seemed to redefine every assumption I had made about who I was and what I was capable of wanting. When we separated, it was gradual, neither of us eager to fully break the connection. Marcus remained close, his forehead nearly touching mine, his breathing slightly uneven. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the same as they had moments before, but the room itself felt transformed, as though we had crossed some threshold that changed the fundamental nature of the space. "You're not like me," I said finally, my voice cracking on the words, revealing the fear that had been building behind every careful interaction, every stolen glance, every moment of connection I had told myself meant nothing. Marcus shook his head slowly, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I don't know what I am," he said. "I just know I don't want to stop." The honesty in his admission was both terrifying and liberating, an acknowledgement that neither of us fully understood what was happening between us, only that it felt too significant to ignore or dismiss. In that moment, sitting in a high school locker room on a Friday night in November, surrounded by the ordinary equipment of teenage athletics, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. Some long-held breath finally released. The weekend that followed the kiss stretched like a wound that wouldn't heal. I spent Saturday morning grading papers with an attention that bordered on obsession, marking every misplaced comma and awkward transition as though precision in grammar could restore order to a world that had shifted off its axis. The red ink bled across page after page of student essays about the Great Gatsby's green light, their innocent observations about longing and unattainable dreams cutting too close to truths I wasn't prepared to examine. By Sunday, I had convinced myself that Friday night had been a mistake born of exhaustion and adrenaline, a momentary lapse in judgment that Marcus would surely recognize as such. Men like him didn't kiss men like me in high school locker rooms. Men like him had girlfriends waiting in other towns or would find them soon enough once the novelty of small-town life wore thin. The rational part of my mind constructed elaborate explanations for what had happened, theories that transformed a moment of profound connection into a simple case of misread signals and temporary confusion. But when Monday arrived and I saw Marcus setting up his training station with the same methodical care he had always shown, when he looked up and caught my eye across the gymnasium with an expression that held no regret or embarrassment, only a quiet intensity that made my chest tighten, I understood that my weekend of rationalization had been an exercise in willful self-deception. The week that followed was a masterclass in careful avoidance, disguised as professional normalcy. I arrived at practice exactly on time rather than early, stayed precisely as long as necessary rather than lingering, and filled every moment with tasks that require my complete attention. When Marcus approached with questions about scheduling or equipment, I provided efficient answers that discouraged further conversation. When he suggested dinner at Mickey's Grill with the casual tone that had become our routine, I invented prior commitments that sounded believable even to myself. The text messages became shorter, more functional, stripped of the warmth and literary observations that had characterized our electronic conversations. Where I had once shared articles and book recommendations, I now sent brief confirmations of practice times and tournament schedules. Marcus's messages grew correspondingly formal, though I caught glimpses of hurt in the spaces between his words, questions that remained unasked and invitations that were no longer extended. The guilt that accompanied this withdrawal was more intense than I had anticipated. Marcus had done nothing wrong except respond to signals I had been sending for months without fully acknowledging, even to myself. He had been honest in a moment when honesty required courage, had offered himself with a vulnerability that I was now repaying with coldness and distance. The unfairness of my behavior was clear to me even as I felt powerless to change it. Thursday afternoon, as I was loading equipment into the storage room with movements that had become mechanical, Marcus appeared in the doorway with an expression I had never seen before, something that combined determination with resignation in a way that made my stomach clench with anticipation. "We need to talk," he said, not as a request, but as a statement of fact that brooked no deflection. I continued stacking wrestling mats against the wall, focusing on the task with an intensity that was obviously avoidance, but felt like the only defense available to me. "I'm pretty busy right now," I said, the words sounding hollow even as they left my mouth. Marcus stepped into the storage room, close enough that I couldn't ignore his presence, but not so close as to feel threatening. His voice, when he spoke, carried a steadiness that made my careful composure feel fragile and temporary. "You think I don't see it?" he said. "You think I'm just confused or experimenting or going through some phase that doesn't mean anything?" The directness of his words cut through the elaborate justifications I had been constructing all week. I turned to face him, finally, and saw in his expression a clarity that made my own confusion feel shameful by comparison. "I built my life to be safe," I told him, the admission feeling like stepping off a cliff. "My job, my reputation, my place in this town. I can't afford to lose any of that for something that might not even be real. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with an attention that made me feel simultaneously seen and exposed. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a sadness that was more devastating than anger would have been. "You think what happened between us wasn't real?" he asked. "You think I would risk my own career, my own place here, for something I wasn't certain about?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications I wasn't prepared to face. Marcus had his own reputation to protect, his own professional relationships that could be damaged by association with scandal or rumor. His willingness to approach me, to initiate that conversation and that kiss, suggested a certainty about his feelings that I had been too afraid to recognize. "I'm terrified," I said finally, the words feeling like they were being torn from some deep place inside me. "I'm terrified of wanting something I can't have, of risking everything for someone who might decide this was all a mistake." Marcus stepped closer then, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough to smell the faint cologne that had become associated in my mind with safety and danger in equal measure. "But if you do want this," he said, his voice soft but uncompromising, "you have to choose it. I won't beg for something you're not willing to fight for. I won't be your secret, or your experiment, or your maybe someday." The ultimatum was delivered without cruelty, but its finality was unmistakable. Marcus was offering himself completely or not at all, requiring a level of commitment that my careful, protected life had never demanded. He waited for perhaps 30 seconds, long enough for me to understand that silence was itself an answer, then nodded once and turned toward the door. "I'll give you time to think," he said without looking back. "But I won't wait forever." That night, alone in my apartment surrounded by books that had always provided adequate companionship, I sat in the darkness and finally allowed myself to imagine what choosing him would mean. The risks were real and significant, but so was the possibility of something I had never allowed myself to want. For the first time in years, maybe in my entire adult life, the prospect of safety felt less compelling than the prospect of truth. Friday morning arrived gray and cold, the kind of November day that feels like a dress rehearsal for winter's sharper cruelties. I had barely slept, spending most of the night staring at the ceiling of my bedroom, while my mind circled through the same questions that had been haunting me since Marcus's ultimatum. The books that line my walls seemed to mock me with their stories of people braver than I had ever been, characters who risked everything for love or truth, or some combination of both. By dawn, I had made my decision, though decision implies a rational process that bore little resemblance to what had actually occurred. It was more like a surrender, a recognition that the careful life I had constructed was no longer large enough to contain who I was becoming. The fear remained, sharp and present, but it had been joined by something stronger. The understanding that some risks are worth taking not because success is guaranteed, but because the alternative is a kind of spiritual death. I drove to Marcus's apartment complex through streets that felt both familiar and foreign, as though I were seeing my own town through different eyes. His building was a modest two-story structure on the edge of downtown, the kind of place where young professionals and divorce teachers lived while they figured out their next steps. I had never been inside, had never even driven past it deliberately, but I had memorized the address from school records weeks ago without quite admitting to myself why. Standing outside his door, I felt the weight of every choice that had brought me to this moment. The careful distance I had maintained from my colleagues, the relationships I had avoided, the parts of myself I had kept hidden even from my own conscious examination. My hand shook slightly as I raised it to knock, a tremor that spoke of how fundamentally I was about to alter the trajectory of my existence. Marcus answered the door wearing a gray sweater and jeans, his hair still damp from a morning shower. The surprise on his face gave way quickly to something more guarded, as though he were preparing himself for another conversation about why we couldn't be what we both wanted to be. But when he saw whatever expression I was wearing, something in his posture shifted, became more open, more hopeful. He stepped aside to let me enter, closing the door behind me with a soft click that seemed to seal us into a space apart from the ordinary world. His apartment was smaller than mine, but felt more lived in. Books scattered on surfaces rather than organized on shelves, a guitar leaning against one wall, photographs from his playing days mixed with candid shots of friends and family. It was the home of someone who expected to be happy in his own space, a concept that felt foreign to my own carefully neutral existence. We moved to his small kitchen without speaking, the silence heavy with everything that needed to be said and everything that had already been communicated through the simple fact of my presence here. Marcus put coffee on to brew, his movements automatic while his attention remained focused on my face, reading something there that I hoped conveyed what words had failed to accomplish. I was wrong, I said finally, the admission feeling like stepping off the edge of everything I had known about myself. About us. About what I thought I could handle. Marcus leaned against the counter, his arms crossed, but his expression open, waiting for me to continue. The morning light streaming through his kitchen window cast long rectangles across the linoleum floor, and I found myself thinking about how different this illumination felt from the harsh fluorescence of the school, how much softer and more forgiving. I've spent so many years being careful, I continued, the words coming easier now that I had started. Being safe, making sure I never wanted anything I couldn't have, never risked anything I couldn't afford to lose. But you make me want to be braver than that. Something shifted in Marcus's expression then, a guardedness giving way to something that looked like relief mixed with joy. He pushed himself away from the counter and took a step toward me, closing the distance that had felt insurmountable just moments before. "You sure?" he asked, his voice carrying a gentleness that acknowledged how much courage this conversation required. "Because I meant what I said. I won't be your secret. I won't be something you're ashamed of." I reached across the small space between us, my hand finding his with a deliberateness that surprised me. His fingers were warm and callous from years of athletic training, real and solid in a way that made the risks we were taking feel less abstract, more worthwhile. "I'm sure," I said, and for the first time in years, possibly in my entire adult life, I meant it completely. We stood there in his kitchen, hands linked, coffee brewing behind us, morning light painting everything in shades of gold and possibility. There were no declarations of love, no promises about forever, no attempts to map out a future that neither of us could predict. Instead, there was simply presence, the acknowledgement that we were choosing each other despite the complications, despite the risks, despite the uncertainty that stretched ahead of us. Marcus squeezed my hand gently, his thumb tracing across my knuckles with a tenderness that made something tight in my chest finally relax. Outside his kitchen window, the world continued its ordinary business, but inside this small space, something new was beginning. The coffee finished brewing, filling the kitchen with its rich aroma, but neither of us moved to pour it. We remained connected by our joined hands and the morning light, breathing deeply for what felt like the first time in years, finally allowing ourselves to imagine what it might mean to be happy together. There was no certainty about what would come next. The school, the town, the carefully constructed professional lives we had built would all need to be navigated with a wisdom neither of us possessed. But in that quiet moment, surrounded by the ordinary magic of morning coffee and streaming sunlight, those challenges felt manageable, conquerable even, as long as we faced them together. I'd spent 28 years learning to live safely, and now I was finally ready to learn what it meant to live truthfully. In Marcus's small kitchen, with our hands intertwined and the future spreading before us like an unwritten story, I understood that some risks are not risks at all, but the only path to becoming who you were always meant to be.